In my family, love came with conditions printed in fine print that nobody warned you about until it was too late to walk away. My father built Caldwell Capital from nothing, or so he told anyone willing to listen, a private equity firm managing over $4 billion in assets, with offices in Dallas, Denver, and New York. He had the kind of name that made restaurant hosts suddenly remember they had a table available. He had the kind of money that made people confuse fear with respect. And he had 2 children, my brother Preston, who he treated like a crown prince, and me, Ivy, who he treated like a very expensive intern he hadn't decided to fire yet. I worked at Caldwell Capital for 6 years, not because I needed the job, because I thought working alongside my father would eventually make him see me, really see me. I ran the risk analysis division. I built the compliance infrastructure from scratch after the SEC audit of 2019 nearly cost the firm its license. I worked 70-hour weeks and wore it like a badge of honor. My father's acknowledgement was the salary I was actually working for. Preston, 3 years older, could not have found the compliance department on a map. He was in business development, which at Caldwell Capital meant he took clients golfing and put it on the expense account. He closed deals because our father introduced him to people who felt obligated to say yes. And every time Preston signed something, my father announced it at the Monday, all hands like a papal decree. My work existed in the footnotes. Good quarter? Risk team did solid work. Clean audit? Compliance held the line. Nobody's name in those sentences, just the department, just a function. I told myself it was the industry. I told myself it was how these things worked. I told myself a lot of things in those years that I now understand were ways of not having to feel what was actually happening. Then I met Seth. I met him at a charity gala that my father's firm sponsored every October, Seth Hargrove. He was there representing a foundation, not a fund, which at my father's table meant he was already at a disadvantage. He wasn't wearing a Rolex. He drove himself there in a car that was 3 years old. When my father's colleague asked what he did, Seth said he worked in infrastructure development, which is the kind of answer that makes wealthy people nod and immediately look past your shoulder for someone more interesting. I found him fascinating. He was calm in a way I wasn't used to. Not quiet calm. There's a difference. Quiet people are holding something back. Calm people have already decided something. I didn't know what Seth had decided yet, but I spent most of that evening finding out. We dated for almost 2 years before he proposed. I knew long before the ring that I was going to say yes. I also knew, long before I told my father, that saying yes was going to cost me something. I just didn't know how much. My father sat across from me, at the kitchen table of my parents' house in Highland Park, which is what people in Dallas call the neighborhood where money goes to feel comfortable. He listened to me talk about Seth the way you listen to a weather report for a city you're never going to visit. Politely, with total detachment. What's his background? My father asked. He went to UT. He has a master's in civil engineering. He's been running. Family background. I set down my coffee cup. His dad was a teacher. His mom worked in hospital administration. My father nodded once. And what exactly does he bring to the table? I stared at him. He's the person I want to spend my life with. That's a feeling, Ivy. Feelings change. Stability doesn't. My mother, Renata, was in the kitchen behind us, making herself very busy with a dish that didn't need washing. She had a gift for becoming architecturally invisible when my father said things she didn't want to be accountable for agreeing with. I'm not asking for your approval, I said. I'm telling you I'm getting married. My father looked at me with the expression he usually reserved for quarterly reports that missed projections. Then you should know that if you go through with this, I'll be restructuring your arrangement. My arrangement, your trust access, your position at the firm, your role in the estate planning we discussed. He folded his hands. You're 31 years old. I've been patient. I'd hoped you'd make a different choice. Patient. As if my entire professional life had been a holding pattern while he waited for me to marry someone with a Bloomberg terminal. I drove home that night with my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went pale. I called Seth from the driveway of my apartment and told him everything my father had said. There was a pause on the line. Then Seth said, Okay. We're still getting married, right? Yes, I said. Then okay, we'll be fine, Ivy. He said it, the way calm people say things. Like they've already run the math. We got married on a Saturday in April at a venue in Fort Worth that I'd booked and paid for myself with money I'd saved from my own salary. I'd opened a separate personal checking account a year before our engagement, which I now understand was my instincts protecting me before my brain caught up. I'd been careful. I'd been meticulous. I'd learned from working in compliance that the best protection against risk is documentation. My father walked me down the aisle. I hadn't asked him to. My mother had asked on his behalf, and I said yes because I am apparently still capable of hoping that people will surprise me. He was in a suit. He smiled for the photographs. He gave a toast at the reception that was technically warm if you didn't know him well enough to hear what was missing from it. And then, the following Monday morning, I received a formal letter from the firm's HR director, to the firm's general counsel, informing me that my position at Caldwell Capital was being eliminated as part of a structural reorganization, effective in 30 days. My access to the family trust was suspended pending review. And a separate email from my father's estate attorney notified me that I had been removed as a beneficiary from the will, replaced with a charitable foundation to be administered by Preston. All of it, in writing. All of it on the Monday after my wedding. I sat in our kitchen reading those emails on my laptop while Seth made coffee. I read them twice. Then I closed the laptop and looked out the window at the backyard, which was still full of the April morning light that had no idea what kind of day it was turning into. He actually did it, I said. Seth set a mug in front of me and sat down. Tell me. I told him, all of it. Seth listened without interrupting, which is one of the things about him I've never been able to fully explain to people who didn't grow up with fathers who talked over everyone. The experience of being listened to completely feels radical when you're not used to it. When I finished, Seth nodded. He drank his coffee. He said, "We need to call Marcus Holt this week." "Who's Marcus Holt?" "My attorney." "Seth," I said. "I just lost my job and my inheritance in one email." "I know." He reached across and squeezed my hand. "And we're going to be fine. I need you to trust me the way I trust you." I looked at him. This man my father had dismissed. This man who drove a 3-year-old car and didn't wear a watch with a 4-digit price tag. This man I'd chosen. "Okay," I said. I believed him. I still didn't know why I was so certain, but I believed him. I spent the 30 days of my notice period documenting everything, every process I'd built, every compliance framework I'd designed, every system that kept Caldwell Capital operating cleanly. I took nothing that belonged to the firm, but I inventoried everything that belonged to me. My knowledge, my credentials, my contacts, and 6 years of expertise that no reorganization memo could eliminate. On my last day, Preston stopped by my office. He leaned in the doorway with the energy of someone delivering news they'd been looking forward to sharing. "Dad said to tell you the door's open if you change your mind," Preston said. "You know, about your choices." "Tell him I appreciate that," I said. "You're really going to throw away everything over some guy?" I looked at my brother, this person I'd grown up with, competed with for our father's attention and come in second every single time without quite understanding why until I was old enough to realize the race was rigged before I entered it. "Preston," I said, "I'm not throwing anything away. Watch." He laughed. He thought I was being dramatic. I started Meridian Risk Advisors 6 weeks after my last day at Caldwell Capital. I had savings, I had credentials, I had a business plan I'd been drafting quietly for 8 months, which I now understand was another way my instincts were protecting me before the situation made it necessary. Seth connected me with 2 of his colleagues in infrastructure development who needed independent risk assessment for a $200 million municipal contract. Those were my first clients. We worked out of our dining room for 3 months and then leased a small office in uptown Dallas. I did not tell my mother about any of this. This is important. My mother was not a villain. She was something more complicated, and, in some ways, more painful than a villain. She was a person who had made her own accommodation with my father's world, and had decided, somewhere along the way, that survival in that world required not noticing things. She loved me. I believe that. But she also reported back always, because reporting back was how she maintained her position. And I could not afford to give her anything to report. So I was warm when she called. I was vague about work. I said things were fine, we were getting settled. Seth was busy with a new project, none of it was a lie. All of it was carefully insufficient. 8 months in, Meridian had 4 employees and a client list that included 2 municipal governments and a regional bank. Seth's infrastructure work was funding an expansion into Mississippi and Tennessee. He'd won a contract to assess a series of aging bridge systems for a state DOT, which is the kind of project that sounds unglamorous until you understand the scale. It was a $340 million project. He had been managing a portfolio of similar contracts for the past several years, quietly, without a Rolex. My father did not know any of this. What my father knew was that I had started some small consulting operation, and that, according to my mother's reports, I seemed to be keeping my head above water. He filed this under acceptable consequences. He had restructured, I had adjusted, life continued to orbit him the way he expected it to. Then Caldwell Capital started losing business. It began with a mid-sized manufacturing company in Fort Worth that had been a client for 11 years. They moved their risk advisory work to an outside firm. Then a real estate developer who'd done 3 deals with Caldwell walked away at renewal. Then 2 smaller clients in the same quarter. Preston told my father it was market conditions. My father believed him because my father wanted to believe him. Preston had been given charge of client retention as part of his expanded role, the role that now existed partly because my position had been eliminated. What neither of them knew was that 3 of those departing clients had called me, not because I had solicited them, because in 6 years of building Caldwell Capital's compliance and risk infrastructure, I had built relationships with the people at those companies who actually understood what risk management meant. And when they started looking for alternatives, they found me. I referred 2 of them to other firms. I didn't want there to be even a shadow of impropriety. I built a wall between what I knew from my years at Caldwell and what Meridian could ethically offer. I consulted with Marcus Holt on every edge case. I was so careful it was almost punishing. The third client, a logistics company run by a woman named Beverly Crane who had the sharpest financial mind I'd ever encountered outside a CFO's office, I accepted after a thorough conflict review. Beverly had specifically sought out Meridian after doing her own research. She wasn't a Caldwell client anymore when she called me. She'd already left. I watched what happened to you, Beverly told me over coffee at her company's headquarters in Irving. I watched that firm for years and I watched what your father did with you. I knew what you'd built there. When I heard you'd left, I waited 6 months to make sure you were the real thing and then I called you. I didn't know what to say to that. I thanked her. Don't thank me, she said. I'm not doing you a favor. I'm hiring the most competent risk advisor in this market. The favor was your father's to me when he let you go. Beverly's contract was the largest Meridian had signed. And Beverly, it turned out, was connected to half the regional business community in ways that made my father's network look parochial. Meanwhile, Preston was explaining to my father that the client losses were an industry-wide phenomenon. He had data to support this. What he didn't have was the truth. The truth was that Preston had spent the 18 months since my departure neglecting the technical relationships I'd built, because Preston had never understood that those relationships were the architecture beneath the business, invisible until it collapsed. My father called me in November 14 months after the Monday emails. He called my cell phone. He hadn't called my cell phone since before the wedding. His name appeared on my screen and I sat very still for 3 full seconds before I answered. Ivy. His voice was measured. My father was always measured when he wanted something. Dad, how are you settling in? Your mother tells me things are going well. Things are going well. A pause. I've been thinking. There may be room at the firm. A consulting arrangement, not a full return, just a project basis, if you were interested. I looked out my office window, uptown Dallas in November, the kind of day that can't decide between fall and winter. What kind of project? I asked. Client retention strategy. We've had some movement in the portfolio. Nothing critical, but Preston and I think an outside perspective could be useful. Outside perspective. I was the inside perspective they'd thrown away and repackaged as outside. I appreciate the call, I said. Let me think about it. Of course, my father said, with the warmth of someone who never expected to have to ask twice. I hung up and called. Seth. He called, I said. I know. You knew he'd call? I thought it would be October, Seth said. I was off by a month. I laughed. It came out strange, a little ragged. He's losing clients. I know, Seth. I paused. How do you know? Beverly Crane and I have worked together on 2 municipal projects in the last year, he said. She mentioned she'd moved her risk advisory work to a firm she was very happy with. She said the founder had excellent judgment in a complicated family situation. I sat down in my desk chair. You knew Beverly before I signed her as a client? I introduced her to your firm. She decided to call you herself. He paused. I didn't tell you because you needed to win that on your own. You would have second-guessed it otherwise. I stared at the ceiling. Seth Hargrove, yeah, what exactly is your infrastructure company really? A pause. Then, do you want the long version or the short version? I want the true version. The true version was this. Seth's firm, Hargrove Development Partners, was not a small infrastructure consultancy. It was a privately held company managing a portfolio of public-private infrastructure contracts across 7 states, with a total asset value north of $800 million. It had been built over 11 years, quietly, without press releases or Bloomberg profiles, because Seth believed that visibility invited competition and he preferred to win without an audience. He had not told me the full scope when we met, because he'd spent his entire career watching money change how people treated him. He'd needed to know that I saw him before I saw what he had. I thought about my father, who had a Bloomberg profile, who measured worth by what you could see. Why didn't you ever say anything? I told you I worked in infrastructure development, Seth said. I told you we'd be fine. Both of those things were true. They were. I just hadn't known the depth of what fine actually meant. I did not go back to Caldwell Capital as a consultant. I called my father the following week and told him, gently, that Meridian's current growth didn't allow for outside projects. He received this with the silence of a man who is not accustomed to being declined by people he's underestimated. What happened next took 18 more months. It wasn't dramatic the way television makes these things look. It was slow and structural and almost boring from the outside, which is how real shifts in power tend to work. Preston continued mismanaging client relationships. My father continued believing Preston's reports over his own observations. Because the alternative was admitting that the reorganization had been a mistake, and my father had built his identity around never making mistakes. 3 more significant clients departed Caldwell Capital. Regulatory attention, the kind that begins with a letter and ends with an investigation, began accumulating around some of Preston's deal structures, which had grown creative in ways that my compliance infrastructure would never have permitted. The SEC opened a formal inquiry in March. My father called a second time. This time his voice did not have the measured quality of the first call. I need your expertise, he said. What's happening at the firm? The inquiry, your systems, the ones you built, they were compliant. What Preston restructured after you left? He stopped. Dad, eyes carefully, you need to retain outside legal counsel immediately, and you need to make sure Preston's the same does the separately. I know that. I'm asking if I can't consult for Caldwell Capital while they're under investigation. The conflict would be too significant. And it wouldn't be appropriate. Silence. I'm saying this as your daughter, I said. Get a clean attorney. Do not try to fix this internally. Whatever shortcuts took, don't compound them by trying as a PR problem. He was quiet for a long time. You knew, he said, finally. You knew he didn't have the technical. I knew the systems I'd built were sound, I said. I didn't know what he'd change after I left. That was true. What I also didn't say was that any competent risk analyst could have predicted the probability of exactly this outcome the moment Preston was given unchecked authority over systems he'd never understood. I had done the math privately and grieved it and kept moving. The SEC investigation ran for nearly a year. Caldwell Capital reached a settlement that included a significant financial penalty and a requirement for a supervised restructuring of their risk and compliance operations. My father's personal involvement was not found to be criminal, but the public record wasn't kind. Preston faced a separate proceeding. My mother called me when the settlement was announced. She cried. Not the careful, managed kind of crying she did when she was performing distress. The real kind, the kind that sounds like something finally breaking. Your father wants to see you, she said. I know, I said. Tell him I'll come to dinner. It was a Sunday. My father's house in Highland Park. The house I'd grown up in, where everything had a price and love came in fine print. He was older somehow, in a way that 3 years shouldn't be able to produce. The Monday emails had cost him more than they'd cost me. I was starting to understand that. We sat in the dining room where he'd told me that Seth didn't bring enough to the table. The table itself was the same. The light was the same, but he was not the same, and I had made a great deal of peace with the fact that I was not the same either. I owe you an apology, he said. He said it the way people say things they've rehearsed so many times that the performance starts to outlast the feeling. But underneath it, I something that might have been real. I'm listening, I said. I should have seen what you built. I should have seen what you were. He looked at his hands. I let Preston tell me what I wanted to hear. And I made decisions about your life based on things that had nothing to do with who you are. I looked at my father, this man I'd spent 34 years trying to earn, who had measured me against a standard designed for someone else, who had fired me on the Monday after my wedding. You did, I said. And I need you to know that I've decided to let it go, not because it was okay, because I don't want to carry it anymore. He nodded. His eyes were wet. My father, who I had never seen cry in my entire life. Seth, he said. I should meet Seth properly. He's in the car, I said. My father blinked. You brought him? He drives me places, I said. He has for 3 years, you just never noticed. I went to the door and waved Seth in from the driveway. He came up the walk in that unhurried way he had, the way of a man who had decided something and was comfortable with whatever happened next. He shook my father's hand. My father looked at him the way people look at something they misjudged severely enough to embarrass themselves. Mr. Caldwell, Seth said. Calm. Just calm. Please, my father said with the diminished dignity of a man who knows he lost more than he won. Call me Robert. The thing about growing up in a family where everything has a price is that you spend a long time believing that love must be earned through performance. You perform competence. You perform success. You perform the version of yourself that you think will finally unlock the approval that's always one achievement away. And then one day you realize that the people who love you without the performance, the ones who saw you before they saw what you had, the ones who stayed in the car waiting without making it a statement, those are the people who were actually paying attention all along. Meridian Risk Advisors has 16 employees now. We are contracted with 4 municipal governments, 2 regional banks, and a growing list of mid-market companies who want their risk infrastructure built by someone who understands what happens when the systems fail. Seth's company broke ground on its largest project yet this spring. We live in a house in Fort Worth with a backyard that gets the morning light early. My father and I have dinner the first Sunday of every month. He is learning slowly to ask questions instead of issuing verdicts. Preston is in a different city, working through his own version of things. My mother puts flowers on the table when I come. And Seth still drives a practical car, because Seth has always understood that what you drive is not the same thing as where you're going. I know that now too, I just had to lose the inheritance to find out.